We're here today to find out about a very important issue for anyone who is invested in funds, and that's finding out where your fund manager has placed the money. With me today is Morningstar Communications Manager Philip Gray. Philip, thanks for coming in today.
You're welcome.
Should investors be aware of their fund's holdings?
All right, look, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. One is that the holdings that are in your fund are going to be what drives the performance of your fund. That's the mixture between the different companies that the fund may invest in. So, your fund may have X% in BHP Billiton, Fairfax, and so forth. I think another really important reason is that Australians, as a population, have a very high rate of direct investment in shares. And if you have a direct shareholding in a company, you might, for example, have benefited from the privatisation of Telstra or the demutualisations of insurance companies in the 1990s. And if you also have a managed fund that has that same company in it, then the chances are that your personal own shareholding in that company will overlap with the holding within the fund that the fund manager has selected for you. And so, again, you're getting away from diversification and you're getting more towards concentration. So whereas if your fund has a high weighting, perhaps it's among its top 10 stocks in Telstra, and you also own Telstra, then you may be actually better off selling your personal Telstra holding and buying a different company, in a different sector, operating in a different kind of business, to get that degree of diversification in your portfolio.
What aren't they disclosing?
Well, at the moment, I think there is a limit on the information available to Australian investors about what their funds hold. And I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. One is that, unlike the United States of America or Europe or a number of other jurisdictions, for instance, there's no mandatory requirement in Australia for fund managers to disclose on a periodic basis what they're actually holding in their funds, what companies they're actually owning in the case of a share fund, for example, and in what proportions. So in the United States of America, that has to be disclosed on a regular basis. It can often be on a time lag, so the fund you're not getting to see exactly what the fund manager owns in a real-time kind of perspective. And that kind of lag disclosure actually helps overcome one of the arguments that fund managers often put forward as to why they shouldn't have to disclose what's in their fund, which is this idea of what's referred to as front-running. So that is, the fund manager's concern is that if investors and other market participants know exactly what's inside the fund, then in terms of the companies that they hold and in what proportions, then other market participants can actually affect the price of those companies by trading on them. So, in a sense, fund managers see that as their own intellectual property, and they're concerned that their future performance will be affected by people knowing too much about what they're doing and being able to influence the price of the companies that they're particularly invested in.
Now, this sort of non-disclosure really affects customers.
Yes, it does. I think it's even more fundamental than that. I think investors have a right to know where their money is being invested. If you have a moral objection, for example, to investing in certain industries or certain kinds of companies, then I think because you've committed your money to a particular fund, you have the right to know where that money is being invested by a fund manager, and therefore you have the right to then, with that informed knowledge, make a decision as to whether to stay with the fund or choose another fund that isn't invested perhaps quite so heavily or isn't invested at all in that particular company or group of companies.
Are all funds like this?
In Australia so far, a number of fund managers are disclosing their holdings on a semi-regular basis to Morningstar, and often also to their investors in the form of perhaps publishing a list of the top 10 holdings and so forth. But it's a very patchwork kind of system at the moment. So your experience as an investor really depends on what your fund manager has decided they want to do. There's no consistency really between one fund manager and another. So your experience as an investor, as I said, is really going to be based on what your fund manager has chosen internally to do, rather than every investor in a fund in Australia being treated equitably, being treated fairly, and having the same access to the same information as the person next door to them.
If investors can't find out what's going on with a fund or where it's invested, why did they invest in it in the first place?
Well, I think they invest in funds because, there's an old saying that says that if you don't know what you're missing, then you don't know what you might have. So in the sense that I think a lot of investors in Australia are just not aware that this is a standard for investors in funds in other parts of the world. We did a study, Morningstar did a global study earlier this year of managed fund investor experiences in the different countries around the world where we operate. And what we discovered was that obviously there were sort of widely varying degrees of transparency between the different countries, the different jurisdictions. And one of the reasons that Australia got marked down in that study is because of the lack of transparency, the lack of after-tax returns, for example, the lack of regular disclosure of portfolio holdings. I think one of the reasons people do invest with funds is that there is still a compelling value proposition for investing in a managed fund. You do get the benefit of pooled investment, putting your money alongside other people, and so forth. But I think in terms of just the way that people can learn about their fund, understand what their fund is investing in, and again, engage with their fund, I think Australian investors deserve better.
So Philip, is there anything we can do?
I think first of all you can ask your fund manager why they're not prepared to disclose their information on a regular basis to you. Not just the top 10, not just the names of the stocks, but not the breakdown in terms of the percentage of the portfolio. Ask them. And find out. I think the second thing you can do is you could write to your Member of Parliament or your Senator and say to them, look, in terms of transparency, in terms of my right to this kind of information, what are you going to do about it?
How long did it take in the US to get this sort of transparency?
Oh, a long time. You know, the funds management industry in the United States was not happy about it either. But I think the regulator over there is perhaps more attuned to the demands and needs of consumers than here in Australia. I think in America, obviously, they have a real culture of transparency and a culture of openness and freedom of speech. That's not necessarily something that we have to the same extent here in Australia.
Thank you, Philip.
Thanks.